The Stele of the Vultures is arguably one of the first pieces of political propaganda that we're going to see in art, and there are rather a lot of them that we're going to see over time. The theme overall is warfare. This is one fragment, but we're looking at really sort of the whole thing, or at least as much of it as we can find. What we see here is essentially, and this is a reconstruction obviously, a historical narrative, a commemoration of a victory. It's really not just propaganda, but it is visual history. And in a society where probably less than 5% of people are literate, this sort of visual history is going to be very important. It's going to be how you remember the great aspects of previous rulers. The ruler in this case had taken over a neighboring city-state. And what we see, for example, is hierarchy of scale. So the more important figures are larger. In this case, I'm going to bring up the pen again so that I can highlight what we're dealing with. Here we have our ruler, and he is gigantic, especially compared to the conquered people represented in a cage. And then we have what appears to be a secondary ruler, general sort of figure behind him, and you'll notice he's again smaller. So the hierarchy of scale is coming into play. It's also quite gruesome. I want to point out not just the bodies, and these are nude bodies in the cage. The reason we are seeing nude bodies being used is nudity, even in the very, very ancient world, is seen as barbaric. And we're talking complete nudity without purpose. Now, obviously, in the Greek world, for example, nudity will be far more acceptable and seen as civilized. However, for most of human history, most civilizations, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Europe, Asia, the Americas, at the same time, nudity generally denotes barbarism. Also, we see the nude figures of the defeated enemy being walked over by the conquering army. Again, a very difficult detail to look at, a very gruesome detail to look at, and it's literally trotting these people underfoot. It's very much visual metaphor. So the idea is, again, to degrade the enemy. Why do you do this? Well, for the same reason the Americans do, or any other society does when we go to war. Think about it. When we go to war with someone, for example, the most recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we weren't fighting Bob the baker, who happens to be working, was working one day and suddenly is part of the Iraqi army or Taliban forces, someone who's been forced into it, who has no choice. Instead, we are fighting terrorists. In Vietnam, we were fighting Charlie, not the Viet Cong. There are always terms for people, and we're dehumanizing them in part because they're the enemy, and it separates them. It makes them subhuman, but also in part so that that soldier, whether with a spear, a sword, or a gun, can look down that barrel and take that enemy life. Because it's one thing to look down that barrel and say, that's a terrorist, I need to kill them. It's another thing to look down that barrel and go, I wonder if he has a family. I wonder if he even wants to be here. Is there a circumstance where he is forced to be here? We don't want our soldiers to be empathetic towards the enemy. Nor do we want the population to be empathetic towards the enemy. We ran into that issue, for example, with the photography and the movies that came back during Vietnam. And so we tend to dehumanize today, just as in the ancient world. The whole piece is just a commemoration, a remembrance of this victory. It's entirely propaganda, speaking to the power and the abilities of the ruler at the time.